So, hello, Mike Ward, legend that is the commentator of life sciences sector across Europe, US, and Asia. I guess you cover just about everywhere with the leading stories. Thanks for agreeing to be interviewed for our conversations in careers to tie into the Building Life Science Adventure Conference, which is really set out to get employers and graduates and early career people together to discuss what works, what doesn't work, and how do we collectively create great careers, not just jobs. But to give some insight to what people think they can do and what helps and what doesn't, maybe we can start, Mike, with you setting the scene a little bit about how you've managed to reach these dizzy heights and how your journey.
I guess. It started off that I was a scientist, so I did biochemistry and chemistry, then did research in plant biology. And at about the age of 25, I kind of realized that while I was really into science, focusing on a little area was not enough. I was one of those individuals who actually spent a lot of time listening to other seminars and talking to other people about their research rather than necessarily focusing on my own. And at the time, this was the mid 80s, there was not a lot of opportunity for people in the sort of the agricultural biotechnology space. My dream of feeding the world, and that was before Bob Geldof coined the phrase, clearly it wasn't clear how that was going to pan out. So I decided I wasn't going to wear a white coat, but I wasn't really sure what else I was going to do until I bumped into the university vice chancellor who knew me because I'd been editing the student newspaper. And he sort of said, "Oh, you must be finishing quite soon. What are you going to do?" And I said, "I've got no idea." And he said, "Well, why don't you become a science journalist?" He said, "You can clearly write." And although I had been sort of, writing and editing student papers for 6 or 7 years while at university, I did that because it gave me access to free tickets to concerts and to plays, and got me free books and free records. So I actually hadn't sort of thought of it as a career, but once that little seed had been sown, I thought, oh, well, why not? And then actually within a few weeks, I'd applied to a publication called Chemistry in Industry, which is published by the Society of Chemical Industry, because they were looking for a biochemist who could write about this new thing called biotechnology, which they thought was going to be consequential to the chemical industry. And so that is, in fact, what I did. I started along those lines, and it was really, really at the early stage. But what was great about it was the fact that I was able to, talk to really, really smart people, be at the forefront of science, and I had the opportunity of communicating that to a wider audience. So over the years, that is effectively what I've been doing.
And when you can look back on that journey, and then obviously with your commentary now, and you see the trends in the industry and what companies are doing, what technologies are coming through in the whole biopharma and life science space, where would you say the future opportunities are? What are the big growth areas going to be for people building careers now?
Wow. I think that that holds. If you'd asked me that question 25 years ago, my answer would be completely different. 25 years ago, we were just beginning to understand the biology. So biology became more important in sort of development of new medicines. Before that, it had been the bailiwick of the chemists. And then sort of the beginning of the 90s, with the start of the Human Genome Program, etc., you saw that the pharmaceutical companies began to embrace biotechnology in a much more important place. So at that point, it was no longer the chemist; it was now the molecular biologist. Now I think it's data is far more important as we kind of start understanding all the various components within the healthcare system. Being able to sort of integrate all those data points and be able to actually have all that information and managing that information. So I actually sort of think that the, sort of going forward, it's actually around being able to handle all the sort of the megabytes or terabytes of data associated with sort of your medicine and the biology of disease, and then translating that into something that is actually meaningful in terms of benefits to patients and individuals. So I think that's where the future actually lies, understanding all this data and how we can harness that to produce more effective treatments.
Well, I guess that's sort of an interesting shift of where different skill sets become important as technology and knowledge grows. You started off as a scientist and then you end up writing about science. Within science, or even from outside science, do you think it's sort of essential to have had the science training to go for a career in science communication, or can you learn enough about science as you commentate and write about other things?
So again, that's a really interesting question, because I think originally I would have said, yes, you actually have to have that sort of science background to be able to understand the language of the scientists. However, the Financial Times, which is it's a business newspaper, what really surprised me that there were a number of science editors on the Financial Times who actually weren't sort of scientists as I would sort of necessarily have seen them as scientists, but they were really, really smart people. And I think that for example, in science communication, I think you just got to be curious. I think you've got to ask the right questions and always sort of say, does that make sense? And if you don't understand something, well, just ask the question in a slightly different way. You'll get a slightly different answer, and then you might get some understanding of what that is. So I think that it's not necessary. Obviously, it does help, though. And in fact, some of the best science communicators actually had to learn how to communicate.
But that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because as much as science is a skill and an attitude, so is communication. And you have to learn your craft, I guess, in those. So yeah, some great scientists need to be taught how to communicate better. And I guess it's similar to communicators to some degree have to be guided in how to write about science in a way that it makes sense, and I think maybe you touched upon this next, or the answer to this next question. But when you look now, what or who are you most grateful for during your career? What's given you nudges in the right direction or enabled you to succeed?
I guess you're my first editor who I'd spent all weekend writing a particular article, and it must have been about 1,500 words. And I remember handing it in on the Monday. So this was like in the early days of my career. And he managed to edit it down to 80 words. And I was devastated. I just thought, I've spent all weekend and, clearly everything I wrote was just complete nonsense. And he managed to get it down to 80 words. And, what was absolutely fascinating was that 80 words actually told the whole story. And I remember sort of asking him, have I made a mistake here? Should I give up? Am I ever going to be a writer? And his response was, everything that needed to be in the story was there. All you had to do was just focus on it. Think about the reader. Okay, pity the reader. Actually when you sit down to write, for example, a story, put your head in the mind of the reader. What is it that they are looking to do? And if you sort of focus on that, then you ask the sort of, what are the questions they're going to be asking? And that's where you focus. The other thing, and again, it kind of relates to something which I said earlier, is also the more you do something, the more you practice it, the better you get. So the advice I've always given to journalists, when I've been managing them, is the more you write, the better you get, because you eventually get into the right kind of pace. And the other thing is also is to actually look at what other people are doing, and again sort of get sort of examples of best practice. So read what your competitors are doing, but read other publications. Read novels, read the financial press, etc. Because you can learn a lot of things. I mean, I've done chaired panels, etc. And I kind of joke and sort of say, look, my approach is more Graham Norton than Jeremy Paxman. And although it's meant to be humorous, there is a sort of a sense of actually looking at how a person is able to get an interviewee, a panelist, to share more information, and sort of looking at sort of how they do it and sort of thinking, right, okay, I'll try and adopt some of those behaviors, because that might draw people out.
So it's only sprung to me now, because we haven't talked about this question at all. But as you mentioned, you chair panels regularly, and you have for One Nucleus. If you had to pick one person who's been your favorite person on a panel or you've interviewed, who would it be?
Oh, wow. There have been so many, for so many different reasons, where they've said something which it's like, wow, that's a surprise. I don't know. I guess Jane Asher was a delight. She was on a panel two or 3 years ago, and when you proposed her onto the panel, I was thinking, what am I going to say? What am I going to ask her? And yet she was absolutely brilliant, and it was a different perspective. And then there was Anne from sort of the chair of the Scout Association. Again, she came with a different perspective. And again, I think that is, it's great about those meetings, by bringing somebody from outside, but have a different experiences that they can share. It allows people then to sort of sit back and think, oh yes, that might be something that actually I could incorporate into what I do.
So I think that's, looking through that, I think there's just the enthusiasm and passion you have for talking about great science and being curious sort of rings out from that. But, if there were budding science journalists out there watching this, what do you think is the one key characteristic that makes for a good science journalist?
I think this sort of, you're being curious, being skeptical, right? And by skeptical, I mean I ask the questions, sort of pose, almost be devil's advocate, and just always sort of think, does that, what that person has just said to me, does it make sense? Because if it doesn't make sense to you, then it's going to be very, very difficult to communicate that to other people. So it's always, there was a guy at the Financial Times. He was sort of the chemicals pharmaceuticals correspondent, and it was once we were at a conference. It was at the sort of the end of the 80s. Ciba-Geigy, which was the forerunner to Novartis. And Ciba-Geigy was a chemicals company as well as a pharmaceutical, agrochemicals, etc., etc. And they had this branch called Fine Chemicals. And I remember Peter asked the question, do you mind, could you sort of explain to me, how fine are these fine chemicals? And I thought, well, that's a sort of like a really odd question. And I sort of asked Peter, so why did you ask that? Because crikey, it makes you look like you don't know. And he says, yes, of course. He said, I know what fine chemicals are. He said, but people bandy around this jargon, and I'm just looking for a way that can I actually explain it to my intelligent but not necessarily au fait audience, when it comes to the chemical industry. And he said, there's no such thing as a stupid question. But sometimes you might actually write down something stupid if you've misunderstood what's actually meant to be communicated in the first place.
Yeah, very true. So I'm conscious I've taken a bit of your time, but if we go back a decade or two to when you were in your 20s, what advice would you give your 20-something self now?
Wow. I think just trust in yourself. I think it's, I mean, one of the advantages that once it was sort of suggested to me, oh, you should be, you should become a writer, you should be, be a science writer, etc. It was then, of course, that's what I should do. And I guess, that is what I've always pursued. I think that what I have done, and if somebody had actually given me this advice, it would have been useful, is when you're looking for the next position, it's never just about how much more money you're likely to get for going to that position, but actually always look and sort of think, am I going to learn new skills that are going to make it easier for me to get my position after that? So always sort of think of the sort of almost like intangible benefits in terms of what you're going to learn.
Mike Ward, it's clear why you've made it to being the global leader of thought leadership at DRG, part of Clarivate. Thank you for your time and insight, and I'll look forward to seeing you on those panels soon. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Lovely to be here, Tony. Thanks.